Alright guys, so welcome everyone to day 3 of recording Dojo course 2. But those of you who are watching these videos, this information is probably meaningless to you because you probably just watch all the videos at once and binge watching because you can't stop, and don't blame you. The next topic we're going to cover is content part and content type development. We're going to store data in this section as well, but a little bit differently. So the next thing we're going to do is create a content part class. So the content part is one of the content management concepts of Orchard that we have talked about before. So I'm just going to stop to this and go to models and add a new class. And the name should be personalist part. Okay. So. What is... Oh, okay, my brace lining is not okay. I think it's easier to find this new line. Yeah, I guess I was developing some Orchard bug fixes, so... yeah. There you go. Ah, it's much better. This is the good way. This is the right way to, yeah?
Can you zoom in a bit?
Absolutely. So now I can zoom in. Okay. So just a little bit of information. So Orchard is currently using the I don't know what it's called, the brace timing, where you put the opening brace on the same line as the class name or method name or whatever. Orchard Core, which is the new generation of Orchard written on .NET Core, is using the old man brace timing, which is always new line, and that's the good way to go. But it would be really tedious for Orchard. Well, probably not so tedious, but it would be a little bit of difficult to migrate to Orchard because there's a lot of open pull requests. So all of them would have like an insane amount of merge errors. So, but we may do it one day, hopefully. Okay, so now we have our content part class, but this is currently just a regular class. It's totally meaningless for Orchard. So what we need to do here is actually declare it as a content part, and the way to do it is basically just saying that this class inherits from content part. And if you hit Ctrl dot, you will see that you can add the using for Orchard.content management. So that's what we're going to do. So that's what we do. Oh, okay. So let's try again. So that's what we're going to do. But you also need to use the generic declaration, so we're going to create another class because basically in Orchard there are, as for content parts, there are basically 3 ways of storing data. One of them is storing them in the info set, which is basically a denormalized data storage inside the record itself in XML format. And this is a good way, this is basically a document DB-like storage. So if you don't need to query those data, but you need to fetch a set of data all at once without a lot of joins, and basically in that way increasing the number it takes to complete the query. If you have a complete set of data in one place, then InfoSet or document DB-like storage is a good way to go because you can fetch it all at once, deserialize it, and there you go. The other way is basically the same as what we did before with records. So normal relational database data storage, and that's a good way to go if you want to query on those data. You want to normalize your data, so put it in different tables, run a few joins, run different kind of queries, different kinds of queries on them, and things like that. And there's a middle ground, basically, which is a really very neat solution introduced to Orchard, I think, 1.7, Orchard 1.7, I'm not sure, 1.6 maybe, which is called the hybrid info set. So the hybrid info set is basically the best of 2 worlds, where you have info set storage, but you also have record storage. Now, how does it work? So basically what happens is that you have your records, you store your records, you store your data in the records as well, so you can query them. But simultaneously, when you are storing the data, you also put it in the info set as well. So you have basically the same data in different structure in 2 different places, but they are always written simultaneously. So there is no inconsistency between them. But you can basically decide, and well, Orchard can kind of help you with that, but you can basically decide how you want to fetch that data. So if you want to query on that data, then you go to the records. If you want to fetch the set of data that's in one place all at once, then you go to the info set. And since it's always written simultaneously to both places, you won't have any problems with data inconsistency. So it's a really neat way to store data efficiently, but whenever you want to query it efficiently as well, you can do that without performance hits or something like that. So we're going to create another class which is called person_list_part_record, and I'm going to generate class person_list_part_record, not in a new file but in this one. So if I hit enter, it's going to create this new class here below our person_list_part, and this one is to inherit from content part record. And as you can see, I can also add the using with control dot, which is orchard.content management.records. And another thing that may be interesting is that there's another class you can inherit from record classes, which is called the orchard, which is called the content part version record. So the content part version record and the content part record differs in a way that every time you save the content part, whenever it saves data in the record, every time it will create a new record. So basically you have versioning. And this is very similar to, well, this is closely tied to the content management aspect of Orchard, where you can have different versions of the same content item. So if you are storing data in records, and you have content part version records, then that's the place, that's the mechanism that will actually version your changes, or basically store the different versions of your data sets. But this time we're going to use just content part records. So basically there's not much difference in the programming aspect of this. You just inherit from content part version record if you want to version your record classes or your records store data, and that's it. You don't really need to care about anything else, or should we take care of the rest. So what we're going to do here, actually, what is person_list_part for? So in the previous sessions, we have created some person objects, stored them as pure records, not quite Orchard-y, but this kind of data storage has its ways, has its usage in Orchard. So now we have a couple of record objects or person objects as records. We're going to create a new content type called person_list, and it has a part called person_list_part. And this is basically a way for us to define which persons I want to list based on what parameters. So person_list_part is actually going to be the place where I store the parameters for the individual person list content items, which persons to filter on or which persons to display. So I'm going to want to store or actually filter my data based on, well, let's use just the sex of the person. And when you are writing record classes, content part record classes or content part version record classes, you need to use virtual properties. So this is needed for an hibernate, because this is not the actual not the actual class that an hibernate is going to work with. So an hibernate needs to inherit from it. And sorry, it's not integer. And actually it's recognized because it's in the same place. So as you can see, our enum is recognized immediately. And the other property we are going to add here is a virtual integer, and let's call it max count. So we're basically going to have a property to define how many persons I want to list. What's the maximum number of persons I want to list. And I'm going to use the ctor snippet here to generate a constructor for this class, and I'm going to initialize the max count property to 10. Okay, and that's it. That's all we need to do in this class. So now we have our person_list_part, and it has a content part record. So we defined how we want to store what's the data structure. Now we also need to tie it into Orchard. So what we're going to do next is basically create the same properties here as well, and the reason for that will be quite obvious in a sec. So I'm just going to use the propful, and let's call it also the same. I don't actually need a field here. Okay, so now we have this property here, but it doesn't really make sense because this is not defined, right? So how do I get this data? How do I write this data? So the way to do it is to use the retrieve method. And as you can see, we have it immediately recognized. It basically have a couple of overloads. The one we are going to use here is the second one, well, in this list, the second one, which basically requires a lambda expression, the parameters for target expression. So basically, what we're going to say here is that which property of the content part record class I want to retrieve here. And I'm just going to call it X because it doesn't really, it doesn't really matter. And we're going to read the sex property from the content part class. Okay, I need to close this. Yeah, and the other thing I need to do here is almost the same. So we're going to just say the same thing, but not retrieve, but store. So basically what happens here is that whenever you access this property and want to get the value, what's going to happen is that Orchard is going to say that, okay, go to the relevant content part record, retrieve the relevant property, and just return it. And the same goes with store. So whenever you want to store the data, this is the property I want to basically overwrite or access. This is the value, same as normal C# properties. So basically write this data into this property. And in this case of store, because this is a hybrid infoset property, it's going to write to both places like I explained earlier with infoset, both infoset and the records as well. But if I'm lucky, I may have, I have these snippets here from the Dojo library. And we actually have shorthands for writing these properties. And this is what I'm going to use. So this is it has a pretty long name for a snippet. It's called oprop record store retrieve. So we have oprop part, which is just a normal, only record driven content part property. We have oprop store retrieve. This is slightly different. This is infoset only. So if you use this kind of property, like I can explain that there's three kind of properties that you can use, or data storage. When you say this dot retrieve, this actually means that I'm not going to use a record. I'm still in the content parts authority in terms of data storage. So if you use this dot retrieve and this dot store, it's not going to use a record class, only the infoset on the content part. But since we are writing hybrid infoset properties here, using both infoset and a content part record, we're going to use the oprop record store retrieve. So this is a shorthand for the same kind of data storage and data retrieval I just typed before. And this needs to be an integer, and I'm going to say max count. And if you use tab, like these little highlighted areas, you can step using the tab between them, overwrite what you need, and then just hit enter. It's going to update these as well based on what you typed here. So it's really neat. Absolutely. So yeah, it's pretty nice. Makes our life easier a lot. This kind of bootstrapping. Before these snippets, we used to type it all the time, or maybe just copy paste it. Sometimes you need copy paste errors as well. So, but now we have these really nice snippets. And the next thing we're going to do is basically use another type of content part field or property, but you can't. You don't really use it only with content parts. You can use it other places as well. But we're going to use a concept called lazy field. And I have, awesome. So we have all lazy field snippet here. As you can see, it creates a lot of things out of the box. So what's going to happen here is that we have a read-only field. Read-only means this can only be modified inside the constructor. Really what we need to do here is just is to initialize it in a way that we don't have a new reference but a new object rather. What we're going to do, what we're going to store inside this lazy field, just to go on and create this one, is a list of person records. So this property is going to be used to dynamically load all the persons that are relevant to the configuration of this person list. So we're going to say enumerable person list part record. And the name of the field should be persons, and the name of the internal property is going to be person field, and that's it. So it's really neat because whatever you type here is going to be used in these places. So you immediately have this field set up, and then whatever you type here is going to be used here for this public property. And we also need to include enumerable. So I cleaned up the usings just like half a minute ago, which was a mistake. So let's add the usings for system.collections for generic to be able to use enumerable, and then let's add the usings for lazy field, which is coming from orchard.contentmanagement.utilities. So what a lazy field does is that it will only you basically need to define how you want to load the data into this field in another place. We're going to take a look at that in a few minutes. And whenever you want to access it first, it's going to use that loader to load the data in. So if you are not sure that whenever this person is part object is instantiated, you're not sure that you are going to need that data because you won't accept that property, then you don't actually need to load all those data because it may be quite expensive to do that in terms of database performance or CPU performance even. So if you don't need those data all the time, whenever you use person list part, you can define it as a lazy field, so it will only be loaded, it will only be initialized when you need it first. So it's really neat to save computing power. And the reason for this configuration is just that we have a field that we can use locally, or actually from the handler we're going to take a look at. We also have an internal person list field. That's what we're going to actually use in the handler to load the data. This is the actual field that's storing the data, but it's initialized as a new lazy field. And then this is just a public property to be able to read the data. So this is not the way to actually load the data or override the data. Or actually, well, this is a list, so you can access the list and modify the list, but you can't modify or override the list object itself, since this is read-only, because we only have a getter. So yeah, that's basically the structure of these three things.
Okay, so actually we made a slight mistake. And thanks to one of our pupils, this mistake was spotted before it caused, well, it wouldn't have caused problems per se, but you know, we would have, we would be scratching our heads to find what's wrong. So basically, what we need to do here is not retrieve an enumerable person list part records, because that doesn't ring. But it would make sense. No, it wouldn't make sense. So we are retrieving person record objects, okay? And of course we need to update all these to match the same type. So this is how we're going to proceed with person records. Now the next step, what we're going to do is actually do the kind of plumbing to be able to use this content part we have just developed in terms of, you know, Orchard content management. So we're going to use a new migration class because that's the way to do it. And the name we're going to give it is content migrations or contents migrations. Well, just to be sure that we are not, you know, just to make it easier to find it in the example. So contents migrations was the class that this inherits from. Of course, data migration IMPL. I still don't like this class name, but whatever. Okay, so now we have our migrations class. The first thing we need to do is, of course, create a create method to initialize this migration, of course. And one of the properties that we can access here, we're just going to return one, just not to get the squiggly lines. So we're going to use the schema builder as before, because we need to actually create a table in the database that corresponds to the person list part record class. So schema builder dot create table, and in this case we can also use type of person list part record dot name. Okay. So now we have defined that we want to create a table. And the name is generated from the modules, but this migration class is namespace, and the name of the module, and then the table name is generated from the name of the record class, and there's another relevant data migration record class which is generated from the namespace and the migration class's name. So the next step is to basically define what kind of columns we want to have in this table. The first thing is basically just a shorthand. So we can say dot content part record. Okay, like this. So dot content part record is just a shorthand, and if we are lucky, we'll find it. Now it's in using orchard dot content management dot metadata, I think. No? Okay, I'm going to cheat. Orchard core contents extensions. That's actually, yeah, makes sense. Orchard.core.contents.extensions. Or not. Why is it not there? Okay, so like I said, I'm going to cheat. Orchard.data.migration. So is there something wrong with my VS, or? Okay, so I actually found a mistake. So we were having an extra character here, which we didn't need. So create table and dot content part record are actually coming from the same place. And if we hit F12 on the content part record, we're going to see that this is just a little bit of code that makes our life easier. It's basically, the only thing it's doing is adding an ID, a column named ID of the type integer. It's the primary key of our records, which is kind of obvious, and it can't be null. So really easy. It's just something you don't need to care about typing exactly this, because you know that this is what you need for every content part record. And if you take a look at what's below that, dot content part version record is kind of the same thing, but you use it when you have content part version records instead of content part records. It's the same, so we could actually use this method here as well. And it has an additional content item record ID. Actually, we can take a look at why that is. So if we go to the DB and go to Orchard Framework content item record, I'm just going to open it like this. So we have ID data, which is the info set, and that's it. Okay. And if you take a look at if you take a look at content part version record, then what you're going to see here is that we have the ID property, which is coming from the shorthand that I just showed you. It also has a number, so which version it actually is, whether the item is published or latest, that published or not, or latest or not. We have the data, which is this one, so it's a little bit out of sync. And we also have content item record ID here, because whenever we have different versions of the same content part record in the content part version record table, we need to know which actual content item it belongs to, which content items versions we are talking about here. So this is content item record ID, which is the same identifier that you use in the content item record table for ID. So this is a foreign key. All right, so this is the create table command, extensions. And yeah, let's go ahead. So we have content part record here. We also need to add 2 columns, so let's just do that very quickly. One of them is of the type string, because as we have discussed before, we need to use the string as a type for storing enum values, and we're going to also add a type of column of the type integer, which is for max count. Actually, if you are using C#6, which we can do on this machine here, but I'm not going to use it because Orchard is currently not compatible with C#6. You could also type name of person list part dot max count like this. So it's really neat because it's statically typed. So whenever you rename one of these, it's going to be updated and it's not going to break your code. Well, if you run this migration, then it can't really break. If you run this migration on a machine once, it can't really break because the table is already created. So you don't need to change it retrospectively. But if you are installing this module on a new instance, a new Orchard instance, then this is useful because then it could break if it's not the same. So you're going to get a nasty exception from nhibernate. So now we have the actual database table for our content part version, content part record class. We also need to add the definition that I have actually a content part that I want to use in Orchard. So it's not enough in itself just to inherit a class from content part, from a content part class. We need to declare it towards Orchard that this is actually a content part I want to see on the user interface, for example. And that's really easy because there is another helper or a Fluent interface you can use on data migration IMPL, which is Content Definition Manager. And on the Content Definition Manager, we can use the alter part definition method, which is an extension method coming from orchard.contentmanagement.metadata, as you can see, like this. So we're going to use that. And we have to declare or actually define a name first. We're going to use the same type of structure, which is person list part. So the name of our content part is going to be person list part. And make sure that these are always unique because this is a technical name. So you can't have the same, you can't have different content parts with the same technical name, of course, because that's what identifies this. On the UI, for example. And the only, oh, I actually need to close this. I always forget this. So the next thing is we're going to use this content definition manager, or actually this Lambda expression to configure this content part. And the only thing we need to define here is to say that this content part is attachable. And that's also coming from a different namespace, which is called orchard.core.contents.extensions. And this is really useful, actually, if you take a look at that as well, because there are other things here. So if you remember when we were taking a look at content type settings, we had a couple of checkboxes below each other. So and these correspond to the same ones. So creatable, listable, draftable, securable, attachable, and description. So these are actually corresponding to, well, the last two correspond to content parts, and the top 4 correspond to content types. So content types can be creatable, listable, draftable, and securable, and this is the actual info set you need to have inside the content type definition to be able to say that this is securable, for example, or listable. So these are for content types, these 2 are for content parts. So attachable means that you can go ahead on the admin UI and attach this content part to any content type. Description is, well, it's pretty obvious. You are going to see a description below the name of the content part when you are on the screen to select which content part to attach to your type. So yeah, let's go ahead and continue writing our migration. So we have declared the definition, our content part. We have content part record. We actually created this content part and defined it as an attachable one. So the next thing to do is to create a content type. So we have created a content part. Let's use it for something useful. And I'm going to go back to the Solution Explorer. So the next thing is to create a content type, and we're going to use the same content definition manager. And this time we're going to say alter type definition, which is coming from the same namespace as alter part definition. So the name should be something unique in this case as well, because content types have their unique technical name. We're going to actually apply a convention here that we like to use, is to statically type this as well, because this is not actually tied, the name of the content type is not actually tied to a class, for example. So you could have I don't know, whatever type. You could have your content type named whatever and still attach person list parts to it. So the type can be really anything. We usually statically define these as in a way that we are using classes for constants. So let's just create a new class, constants, and let's make it static, or well, yeah, static. And we're going to create a nested class, so public static class, let's say it content type names. And in this one, we're just going to say that we have a constant of the type string, which is called person list, and the value should be person list. So if you decide to, if you have to change your content type for some reason, which is, you can basically do it, and it might happen, then you can change it here, and since you are, and if you are using it statically type using this property, then you don't need to change it on every place where you're using it from your code. You need to change it only here. But of course, that's not the only scenario. This is just for you to help you not to make typing mistakes whenever you refer to this specific content type in your code. So you don't need to type the string person list every time. You can use this statically type property. Actually, on a side note as well, if you are using C#6, it's really neat. I actually figured out it that kind of unexpectedly. I just wanted to try if it works. But if you have a property, you can actually give it a value of its name. So you can just say name of person list. Name of is, like I said, is a C#6 language feature. But yeah, for the sake of maybe using dynamic compilation, we're not going to use it because dynamic compilation is not compatible with C#6. And let's just organize the usings because we like to keep our code clean and tidy, and we don't need any usings here. So let's jump back to our migration class, and we're going to say person list and say, so let's just constants dot content type names dot person list. So another neat thing that you can do with C#6 is static usings. So if you say using static and then Dojo course.module dot constants dot content type names, then you can actually leave this part and just say person list like this. But this is also C#6. Okay, so let us continue with defining our new content type. So the name should be, okay, we're going to actually reverse this, all right? Like this. Voila. And, we don't need, okay. Oh, no. All right, so this is just, let's do it right. Okay. Oh, it actually says using static. Oh, that's good. That's a good sign. because Visual Studio wants to do it the right way, but we know that we want to do it, well, now the not wrong way, but old way. So let's just type this. Okay. Oh, actually, we don't need this, of course, yeah, because that's in the root namespace. Okay, so now we have defined what's the name of this type. The next thing to do is basically define what kind of content parts we need to have on this one. So let's start with a couple of obvious ones, or the simple ones. The configuration starts with the displayed as, the displayed as method. This is just a way to define what should be displayed instead of the technical name. So that should be just person list. You can wire it in, you don't need to statically type this, because probably this is the only way where you're actually typing this instead of the technical name. So next is to add the title part. So as we saw, the title part is, well, it gives you the ability to define a title for your content type, not very surprisingly. The next thing is add the auto-route part, which is a nice way to generate user-friendly URLs for your content type. And the configuration for this part is going to be the following. So if you go to the admin UI, you will see very similar things. Basically, what we are going to type here is just the programmatical way to declare those settings, but you will see exactly the same things on the UI, which is a nicer way, but we are writing code here, so we are initializing the settings. So let's type with setting, and when you are defining a setting, this is like this is kind of a dictionary. Define the name of the setting and the value of the setting, and in this case, auto-route settings dot allow custom pattern. So allow custom pattern means that the user can actually define the I can actually overwrite the automatically generated URL. The next setting we need to add is, and I'm just going to copy paste. Actually, I'm going to copy paste this a couple of times and then use that to overwrite it. So the next setting we need to add is automatic adjustment on edit. So this means that whenever you save the content item, it will automatically regenerate the URL from the pattern. And we're going to disable this because, well, if you have this enabled, it doesn't really make sense to enable this and vice versa. So let's just set it to false, because we don't want the system, or actually auto-route, to regenerate the URL every time to save it, because the user may want to have a custom pattern, and that would be overwritten. The next is pattern definitions, and this is going to be very fun to type. So the pattern definitions is, but it's basically a JSON string. So it's really neat because we have a relational database where we store denormalized data using XML, and inside the XML we actually store JSON. So it's kind of perverted in a way. So we need to define, because this is plural, we can have multiple. Oh, I'm actually writing on the wrong place. So pattern definitions. We have an array because it can have multiple definitions, and we only have one instance, and its properties are as follows. So we have the name, which is just title. This is the default one. After that we have the pattern, which should be person lists slash, and then content dot slug. Sorry. And the reason for this being inside curly braces is that this is a token. So when we were taking a look at content management in one of the first sessions, this is basically a token. And content.slug means that take the title part, strip out all the characters that you can't have in a URL. For example, replace the spaces with hyphens. Replace the accented characters with non-accented characters and stuff like that. So basically normalizing the title into something that you can use in a URL. And then the last property we define here is a description. And that should be just whatever, my list. Doesn't really matter. And the last property we need to define is default pattern index. So if you have multiple ones, or actually if you only have one, you need to define which pattern to use by default. And we only have one, and we index it from 0. So we want to use the pattern at the position 0 by default. So let's go ahead with the content type configuration. So with this no, sorry, really no, okay, I'm on the right place. So we have closed the with part definition here. We're going to continue with another with part definition, and that should be adding our own content part. We have just developed here, so it should be type of person is part. And then we also need to add common part. So common part is, well, you won't guess, but it's quite common to have common part on a content type. And it's not common just for no reason. You need to have common part for your content type all the time, because that's a very, very basic, some of the very, very basic functionalities of Orchard depend on storing data and retrieving data from common part. So you need to have that as well. Oh, actually, I forgot the type name here. Actually, what you can also do here is to reference the relevant projects, and you need to also add the dependency, a module dependency if you do that. But if you add a project reference to the orchard.autoroute module, then you can also type, a type of autoroute part.name. So you can statically type it as well. It may be nicer or make kind of, or it might make the code more readable. Doesn't really make a difference, because those class names won't really make change. And the last thing we're going to add here, I usually like to add these kind of definitions at the beginning, is to define that this content type is creatable, and we're going to use that extension method I just showed you earlier that actually corresponds to the content type settings. So it's really nice. We have our own content type now. So let's build our code. Just to be sure, I'm going to hit F6 to rebuild the whole project, or whole solution actually, and see what happens next. So we're going to build our code, run it, see whether the migration actually runs. So for that, we're going to take a look at the Orchard logs to be sure that there's nothing wrong with during the execution of our new code. And rebuild all succeeded, which is really neat. I was kind of expecting that and hoping for that. So apparently we haven't made any coding mistakes, but in terms of compilation, but we will see if it's all right. So what we should see is that whenever our instance starts up, our migrations, since this module is already enabled, our migrations will be executed. So if the application loads and we don't see any problems like an error notification regarding our new migration, and the error log is also empty, which happens to be the case, then we should see our new content type in the admin. And yeah, it's really neat. So if you take a look at this new section here, we already have person list here, and if I click on it, it's going to load the editor of person list. And what you can see here is everything that we have added. So we have the title part editor, this is the autoroute part editor, and other common part stuff. So it's very cool. We have our new content type, it's working. but we have our own content part which actually does nothing. So it doesn't have anything that corresponds to something like this title part editor. So let's add that, because we also need to do that. But first, let's add some more code, because let's say that we want to display persons in some way on the front end, like a person list. In some way on the front end, which should be let's say a widget. So how do we create a widget? Because content part and content type development often includes creating widgets. So you can have your own ones, like similar to the built-in ones. So let's create an update migration. And I'm going to say public int update from 1. So what we're going to do here is create a widget type. So to do that, we're going to go back to our content type names class, add a new one. Like this. So we have our own person list content type with person list part. We're going to have a widget, a widget type with kind of a similar configuration, but it's going to differ in some ways, and it's going to behave differently because widgets and other content types are kind of different in many ways. So let's go back to our migration. In the update from one method, we're going to return 2, because we're updating from version 1 and from version 1 to version 2, and we're going to use content definition manager again and create a new content type with alter type definition. The name of this content type should be type of person list widget. No. Oh, yeah. Like this. So constants the content type's name, content type names dot person list widget dot name will be what's wrong with this one? What? Sorry. So like this. Oh, okay. So I started to type it in another way, like the type of and stuff like that. But we don't need that. So now we have just constant content type names dot person list widget. Sorry. And now we have let's say just type. So we basically do something very similar as before with the person list content type, but this time it's a widget. So the configuration of this one is going to add our own content part, which is person list part. And this time I can just copy paste this. Well, I can copy paste this whole thing, actually. And the next thing we need to add is widget part. So we're going to say with part, widget part. And then add another part, which is, well, common part, which we always need. And there's another type of configuration here, which is called with setting. So we are adding a content type level setting. As you can see here, we have added content part level settings. Well, technically, it's not a content part level setting because this content part setting will correspond to auto route part only when it's used with this content type. So it's only relevant to this type, but this is like its own kind of the type level setting in another way. And this setting is called stereotype, and its value is widget. So stereotype is kind of a declaration. Oh, sorry, it's just with setting. It's basically a way to say that, hey orchard, this is a type, a content type that does something very specific in an orchard terms. We have another stereotype, I think it's menu item. So if you are using the navigation feature in Orchard, if you go to /admin/navigation, then there are a couple of content types on the right side menu, and Orchard knows which type of content, which content types to list there by their stereotype. If their stereotype is menu item, then Orchard will know that this is actually a content type that you will want to use inside the navigation. So that's why you define the stereotype. And for widgets, obviously, Orchard will know that this is a content type that you want to list when you are adding a widget to a zone. So that's why. But actually, I think Orchard.widgets has a nicer way to define this. I think it has a shorthand now. If you go to Orchard.widgets, maybe extensions, yeah, and you go to Orchard.contentmanagement.metadata. So there's a reason why this namespace is not the same as what you would expect, because if you were just to add a class to this project inside the extensions folder, by default you would probably name it orchard.widgets.extensions. But the reason you are creating an extension is to use it alongside with the default functionality or what's available by default in there. So that's why you're putting it in the orchard.contentmanagement.metadata. So you don't need to know which namespace this class lives in, because it lives in the same namespace as the class that you want to extend. So it's immediately available without any additional namespace. So if you take a look at that, if you use as widget, it has common part, widget part, and the stereotype set to widget. And there's another one called common part, widget type, widget part, stereotype widget, and with identity. Actually, let's use that, because identity part is very useful if you want to use import-export with your widget. So by default, it's not going to have a unique identifier, so you won't be able to import-export it easily, because it will be it won't be identified as something a specific content item. And if you take a look at with identity, it's very easy. It's just adding the identity part. So it's really nice that these extensions are tying into each other and extending each other. So let's use as widget with identity. Actually, we can just replace this whole couple of lines of code. If it's available, and it should be, actually. Oh, no, yeah. So the reason it's not available is because I haven't added a project dependency. So let's add, actually project reference. So let's add project reference to orchard.widgets. And as you can see, it becomes available. But of course, don't forget to add a module dependency if you are adding a project reference. You might not always add the project referency if you add a dependency, but you should always add a module dependency if you add a project reference. So dependencies orchard.widgets. Actually, we should also add orchard.autoroute as well, because we've used autoroute part. And I think there's nothing else, because common is common, so you don't need to add that because that's in core. And you can't disable Orchard core, so you don't really need to add a dependency. If you can disable that for some reason, then something's wrong. So that's not your problem. That's not a problem. If you don't add this dependency, if you can break it that way, then there's something else wrong with the instances configuration, and that's a bigger problem. So I think we have showed this earlier, but if you are writing migrations, then it's a really nice way to structure your code in a way that your create method always does everything, including that the update method's doing as well. So we just need to copy paste this code and make sure that the create method also returns the same value as the latest one that you have updated it to.